Alright YouTube, so we are back of course to talk about some Final Fantasy VII Remake, but also again Final Fantasy XVI. I was already planning on doing a video kind of talking about both these games are on the horizon for Square Enix. They're both coming out sometime in the future, and how are each of them going to affect the other in terms of release? And when I hopped on Reddit today, I seen people were already talking about this, so it must be something people are interested in, so I figured, hell, let's make the video. So we're just going to hop right into it. The first thing that stuck out to me when it comes to Final Fantasy XVI is that it has a completely different dev team from what it seems so far. It has a different producer, a different director than the remake. As of right now, when it comes to the dev team for 16, we know that Yoshida's working as the producer, and we know that Takai's working as the director, and they're both more or less known for Final Fantasy XIV. And also, it's rumored that Ryoto Suzuki is the battle director for Final Fantasy XVI. People were saying that he was attached to 16 on my trailer breakdown video, but as far as I've seen, it's not been confirmed yet. But more than likely, he is attached to 16, and that's why the gameplay looks solid. And obviously, when it comes to Remake, we have the sort of main guys at Square Enix attached to the project with Nomura, KITASE, NOJIMA, Hamaguchi. And as of right now, at least as far as we know, there's not any crossover when it comes to the development teams, which is a great thing. That means that them working on 16 isn't like slowing down Remake Part 2 and vice versa. Now, not having the main developers at Square Enix working on 16 can be viewed as both a positive and a negative. It's a positive because you give other talent the opportunity to helm a big release. Like 16 could release and they could just knock it out of the park. It could be one of the best Final Fantasies ever made. For all we know, it remains to be seen. Where the negative could come in is like not having some of the lead guys attached to the project, which they may be, we just don't know yet, but it seems like they're not attached. You feel like they'd like say, hey, Kitase is a producer on 16, because that would get the fans hyped because people like YOSHINORI Kitase. But not having the lead guys attached to the project, it makes you wonder how much faith they actually have in 16, if that makes sense. Like, throwing all the lead devs on Remake and seemingly only Remake makes you wonder, like, do they even really care about 16 all that much, or are they just kind of, like, forcing the release of another numbered entry? Now, Nomura not being attached to 16 would probably make a lot of people out there happy. He's one of those developers that's kind of, like, hit or miss. Like, you either like him or you hate him. And I can kind of understand it, because when it comes to Remake, for example, with that ending with the possible alternate multiple timelines and shit, very Kingdom Hearts-esque, a lot of people weren't happy with it, so I could kind of get where people come from. I don't mind him, though. Now, when it comes to these games releasing, we actually know, as of right now, more about 16 than we do Part 2, simply because we know that they're going to talk more about 16 in 2021. Which I think isn't really a good sign for this game releasing soon, simply because they're not even going to talk about it in a bigger capacity until next year. And with them waiting until 2021 to talk about the game, more than likely it wouldn't release next year, which means it at the earliest would be here 2022. If we just use Remake as an example, they didn't really talk about the game again until 2019, and then it was scheduled to release in March of 2020, and then eventually release in April 2020, almost exactly a year later. Now, on a specific Reddit post that I mentioned earlier, I've seen people talking about the possibility of, like, 16 coming out as late as, like, 2023. I don't know, man, but there is a quote from the director that I found kind of interesting. And it says, "It may still be some time before we can get it into your hands. However, I promise it'll be worth the wait." And actually, there's another quote from the producer on the same blog post that says, "As we have a lot in store, not only for Final Fantasy XVI, but for Final Fantasy XIV, too. Needless to say, I'll be working hard on both." Which means that they're also working on 14 the same time they're working on 16, and it makes you wonder, how much focus is actually on 16. With 14 being an online-only game, with it being an MMO, with constant updates and content added, the focus can't be 100% on either game, so it might be a while before we actually get to see 16 in our hands. I don't know necessarily if the game is as far away as 2023, but when you have the director themselves saying that it might be some time before we actually get it in our hands, it makes you wonder. Whereas if you look at Nomura, who is the director for Remake, obviously talking about Part 2, says that they aim to get it out as soon as possible, which may or may not be true. He could just be saying that to appease the fans, but it's at least more reassuring than it's going to be some time. I also wonder how long they've been working on 16, since it's a next-gen exclusive game. It's coming out on PS5 exclusively for a set amount of time. Like, how long have they had the PS5 technology to develop the game? Like, I assume they've been working on the game since not long after Final Fantasy 15 came out in 2016, but have they had, 4 years now that they've been working and developing for PS5? I don't know. So, what if development's not super far along? Like, yeah, we got a great-looking trailer that was pretty lengthy, and it had gameplay, but we had gameplay for Remake back in 2015, and that game still took, 5 fucking years. Now, obviously, when it comes to Remake Part 2, in terms of news or updates or release dates or anything, we have nothing, and it's rumored that maybe, and a very small maybe, that we could see or hear something at Tokyo Game Show, but other than that, we have nothing on the horizon. But what is working in favor of Remake Part 2 is that clearly the Remake project is more important to Square Enix than Final Fantasy XVI. Like, let's be completely honest here. Just look at the dev team. This comment on the Reddit thread I thought was interesting, so I figured we'd just read it. It says, "If I'm Square Enix, I want to go with a proven product. Final Fantasy VII Remake was a success. It only makes sense for them to prioritize the sequel for themselves and the fans. 16 is a new mainline title that can range from being great to poor. As a fan, there's a lot of unknown variables with this title. With Remake Part 2, we have some idea on what to expect while still being surprised. I will say this though, there is zero chance that both of these titles will be released at the same fiscal year. It does not make sense for them financially, and it puts fans in an awkward position if they can't afford to buy both. I agree with pretty much every aspect of that person's comment, man. Remake is a proven product. Us as the fans and Square Enix themselves know what we're getting into when it comes to Part 2. 16, as I said, could be great, could be a poor game. It's probably going to be successful regardless. It'll probably sell well regardless. But at the end of the day, if they had to prioritize one's release, they would absolutely go for Part 2 of Remake. Something else that's in favor of Remake Part 2, it's a small one, but I think it is important, is the fact that the game is going to be like 99.9% certain a PS4 game, and there's a shit ton of PS4s out there, right? It's one of the best-selling consoles of all time. Just from a financial and investment perspective, it makes sense to release Part 2 because it's going to sell pretty goddamn well. With the amount of PS4s out there in households, with this game selling over 5 million copies at this point, you know upon release of Part 2, when the sequel comes out, it's going to be a success, whereas 16, which will probably still do well, may not be as much of a success. Especially since Final Fantasy XVI is getting that timed exclusivity treatment, and I would be surprised if it sold better than Remake. Another interesting fact that I was actually unaware of that I hadn't really noticed or talked about before that I got from this Reddit post was the fact that when it comes to sequels within the Final Fantasy franchise, like 10 and 10-2 and the 13 trilogy, the sequels came out in about 2 years with both of those sets of games. Final Fantasy X came out in 2001, 10-2 came out in 2003, 13 came out in 2009, 13-2 came out in 2011, and Lightning Returns came out in 2013. Now obviously those games aren't exactly comparable to Final Fantasy VII Remake, but I think it's interesting to take note of the turnaround on sequels when it comes to the franchise. They usually put them out pretty quickly. Now, does that mean it's going to come out before 16? Well, there's really no way to know or speculate that until we get some more concrete info on Part 2, as in, like, when we're going to start getting information for it. But with us knowing when we can expect more info for 16, it kind of makes you think that it might come out first, since we know nothing about Part 2. And since 16 probably won't release until 2022, and 16 and Part 2 will not release within the same year, it makes you think that maybe Remake Part 2 is not going to be out until, like, 2023, which would kind of suck. But as the more said in the past, it kind of comes down to the size of Part 2. If they want to make it a bigger, larger game, it's going to take longer to develop. If they want to make it smaller, detailed sections of the story, they can put it out faster. I mean, it's a relatively obvious statement, but that's what it comes down to when it comes to Part 2. It's like how much content's going to be in there. How far into the world of Gaia are we going to be able to explore and go to? Who knows? At the end of the day, what it really comes down to, since it seems like they have different dev teams and the games aren't really in the way of each other, is how far along are each of them in the development process, and when do they want each of these games to come out in which fiscal year. And that's where I'm going to pass off to you guys. What do you think? When it comes to Final Fantasy XVI, and when it comes to Final Fantasy Remake Part 2, which one do you think is going to come out first? On paper, it definitely seems like 16 would come out first, simply because we know when we're next going to get info for it, and of course we have a goddamn trailer for it, but it could be a situation like the initial reveal of Remake, where maybe they're showing it way too early. The game could still be very far off. And if that does happen to be the case, then Remake Part 2 could be the one that comes out first. But anyways, dudes, that is the video. Hopefully you enjoyed. If you did, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you guys are new and want to more Final Fantasy VII Remake and 16 content. Turn on my notifications. Follow me on Twitter, @dashingdavid, at my Discord. Links to my Starbucks are in the description and in the outro. Later, guys.
Used to care what people thought, but now I care more, and nobody out here's got it figured out. So therefore, I've lost all hope of a happy ending, depending on whether or not it's worth it. So insecure, no one's perfect. We spend it with no shame. We blow that like Coltrane. We in here like Low Gain or leave it like Obang.